The lunch rush at Mitchell's Steakhouse was in full swing when an elderly man in a worn flannel shirt shuffled through the front doors. The hostess barely glanced up from her reservation book. The servers swept past him without a second look. To everyone in that gleaming restaurant, Thomas Mitchell was just another old man taking up space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They had no idea they were looking at a Medal of Honor recipient. They couldn't see the shrapnel scars hidden beneath his sleeves or know about the night in Vietnam when he single-handedly held off an enemy assault to save his entire platoon. All they saw was faded clothing and calloused hands. But sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, and sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal who's really standing in the room with you. This is the story of how one man's quiet dignity changed everything, and why the small pin on his chest held more power than anyone could have imagined. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Mitchell's Steakhouse, one of downtown Portland's most prestigious dining establishments. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a gleaming office tower, its interior a carefully orchestrated symphony of dark mahogany, polished brass, and soft amber lighting. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light over tables draped in crisp white linen, where the city's elite conducted business over dry-aged steaks and $100 bottles of wine. At exactly 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, Thomas Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into this temple of affluence. He was 73 years old, with silver hair that had long since retreated from his forehead, and deep lines etched around pale blue eyes that had seen too much. His frame, once broad and powerful, had been whittled down by time and old injuries, but he still carried himself with the unconscious posture of a man who had once commanded respect. His clothing told a different story than his bearing. The red and black flannel shirt had seen countless washings, its colors faded, but the fabric still sturdy. His jeans were clean but worn, creased from years of honest work, and his boots were the practical kind that prioritized function over fashion. A small American flag pin was affixed to his shirt collar, and beside it, almost hidden in the fold of fabric, was another pin, a small purple heart with gold trim that most people never noticed. The hostess station was staffed by Jessica Morrison, a 24-year-old with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of practiced smile that could shift from welcoming to dismissive in the span of a heartbeat.
"I heard you," Thomas interrupted gently, "and I can see 3 empty tables from here. I'll wait until one becomes available." The standoff might have continued, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb, the restaurant's general manager. Marcus was a man in his early 40s who had clawed his way up from busboy to management through a combination of ruthless ambition and an intuitive understanding of what wealthy customers wanted. He wore his success like armor, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a Rolex that caught the light as he gestured, and the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with the right combination of charm and authority. He had been watching the exchange from across the room with growing irritation. Mitchell's Steakhouse had a reputation to maintain, and that reputation was built on exclusivity. The clientele expected a certain atmosphere, a certain class of fellow diners. An elderly man in work clothes standing at the hostess station was exactly the kind of optics problem that could damage the carefully cultivated brand. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the subtle edge of authority as he approached. Jessica looked relieved at his intervention. "Mr. Webb, this gentleman was hoping for a table, but as I explained, we're completely booked." Marcus sized up Thomas with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading people. He saw the worn clothes, the weathered hands, the modest bearing of someone who clearly didn't belong in his establishment. But he also noticed something else: the straight posture, the direct eye contact, the quiet dignity that suggested this wasn't just any ordinary customer trying to get a free meal. "I apologize for any confusion," Marcus said, his tone professionally courteous but firm. "However, Mitchell's operates on a reservation system. We simply do not have the capacity to accommodate walk-ins during peak hours." Thomas nodded, understanding the subtext. This wasn't about reservations or capacity. It was about appearance, about maintaining the social stratification that kept the restaurant's wealthy clientele comfortable. He had encountered this kind of discrimination before, though it stung no less for its familiarity. "I understand," Thomas said, "but I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be treated like any other customer who wants to pay for a meal." The simple dignity of the statement seemed to hang in the air. Around them, the lunch crowd continued their conversations, oblivious to the quiet drama playing out at the hostess station. Servers glided between tables, refilling wine glasses and taking orders for premium cuts of beef. The restaurant's carefully orchestrated atmosphere of success and sophistication continued unabated. But something had shifted in the dynamic. Marcus found himself looking more carefully at the man standing before him. There was something in Thomas's bearing, in the way he held himself, despite the obvious slight, that suggested depths beneath the surface. The manager's instincts, honed by years of reading wealthy customers, detected something he couldn't quite identify. "Look, I appreciate your persistence, but our clientele has certain expectations. Perhaps we could arrange something for later in the week, a quieter time when there's nobody important around to be offended by my presence," Thomas asked, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard. Most people, when faced with this kind of rejection, either became angry and caused a scene, or simply accepted the dismissal and left quietly. But Thomas Mitchell was doing neither. He was calling out the discrimination with a calm precision that made it impossible to ignore. From across the dining room, other customers were beginning to notice the conversation. A few heads had turned, curious about what was happening at the hostess station. Marcus was acutely aware that scenes like this could quickly spiral out of control, potentially damaging the restaurant's reputation if handled poorly. "That's not what I meant," Marcus said, though they both knew it was exactly what he meant. Thomas looked around the dining room, taking in the expensive suits, the designer handbags, the casual displays of wealth that marked this as a sanctuary for the privileged. He thought about Margaret, about how she would have handled this situation with her characteristic blend of grace and steel. She never would have let someone make her feel small, never would have accepted being treated as less than equal. "My wife used to say that you could tell everything about a person by how they treated people they thought couldn't do anything for them. She was usually right about these things." The comment landed with unexpected weight. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that other customers were listening. Marcus felt a flush of heat rise up his neck, recognizing the truth in the observation. Around them, the restaurant's atmosphere seemed to thicken with tension. It was at that moment that Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his shirt collar, adjusting the small pins there. The gesture was automatic, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. But as his fingers brushed against the purple heart pin, something changed in his demeanor.
His shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, and when he looked back at Marcus, there was something different in his eyes. Not anger, but a quiet strength that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he had endured. The small pin caught the light from the chandelier above, its gold trim gleaming against the purple enamel. For most people, it would have been just another piece of jewelry, easily overlooked in favor of more obvious displays of status. But for those who knew what to look for, it told a story of sacrifice and service that no amount of money could buy.
Marcus's gaze fell on the pin, and something clicked in his memory. A half-remembered conversation with his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had spoken with reverence about the Purple Heart and what it represented. The recognition was like a cold splash of water, forcing him to reevaluate everything about the man standing in front of him. This wasn't just another customer trying to get a free meal or cause trouble. This was a veteran, someone who had bled for the country that Marcus and his wealthy clientele enjoyed in comfort and security. The realization hit him like a physical blow, accompanied by a wave of shame that made his expensive suit feel like a costume. But the moment of recognition came too late to undo what had already been set in motion. The damage was done, the insult delivered, the judgment passed. And Thomas Mitchell, holder of the Purple Heart and keeper of secrets that would shame them all, was about to show them exactly what kind of man they had just dismissed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The silence that had settled over the hostess station was broken by the soft chime of the restaurant's front door. A new customer entered. Richard Sterling, a prominent city councilman whose face was regularly featured in the local newspaper's society pages. He wore his authority like his expensive suit, confidently, conspicuously, and with the assumption that it would open every door. Marcus Webb's demeanor transformed instantly. The calculating coldness he had shown Thomas evaporated, replaced with the warm deference reserved for Portland's political elite. "Councilman Sterling, what a pleasure to see you again," he said, his voice rich with practiced enthusiasm. Sterling barely acknowledged the greeting, his attention focused on his phone as he typed rapidly. "Need a table for 4, Marcus. The Riverside Development meeting ran long, and I've got investors coming." "Of course, sir. Right this way." Marcus gestured toward the dining room's premium section, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city skyline. The contrast was jarring. Here was a man who received immediate, fawning attention simply by walking through the door, while Thomas, a man who had bled for his country that Marcus and his wealthy clientele enjoyed in comfort and security, was left standing at the hostess station like an unwanted intruder. The injustice of it settled over the space like a heavy blanket. Thomas watched the interaction with the detached observation of someone who had spent decades studying human nature in its rawest forms. During his 3 tours in Vietnam, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was often the difference between life and death. He saw through Marcus's obsequious performance to the calculating opportunist beneath, just as he could see through Jessica's fake smile to the casual cruelty that lurked behind it. But something else was happening in that moment of recognition. Marcus had seen the Purple Heart pin, and Thomas could see the wheels turning in the manager's mind. The man was clearly wrestling with the implications of what that small piece of metal represented, his earlier dismissiveness now complicated by an uncomfortable awareness of who he was dealing with. "Sir," Marcus said, quietly, turning back to Thomas. His voice had lost some of its earlier edge, replaced with something that might have been uncertainty. "Perhaps we could find you something after all." Thomas studied the manager's face, seeing the war between pragmatism and conscience playing out in real time. The offer wasn't born of genuine remorse or respect. It was damage control, an attempt to avoid the potential embarrassment of having mistreated a veteran. The calculation was as transparent as glass. "No, thank you," Thomas said, his voice carrying a dignity that made Marcus flinch.
I wouldn't want to disrupt your carefully maintained atmosphere." The rejection caught Marcus off guard. Most people, when offered a face-saving compromise, took it gratefully. They allowed themselves to be mollified by the gesture, even when it came too late and for the wrong reasons. But Thomas Mitchell was not most people. "I insist," Marcus pressed, glancing nervously around the dining room where other customers were now openly watching the exchange. "We have a table opening up in just a few minutes." Thomas followed Marcus's gaze, seeing the curiosity and judgment in the faces of the restaurant's elite clientele. Some wore expressions of mild disapproval, not at the discrimination they had witnessed, but at the scene being created in their sanctuary of privilege. Others looked simply annoyed that their expensive lunch was being disrupted by drama. But there were a few faces that showed something different. An elderly woman in a Chanel suit was watching with sharp intelligence, her eyes moving between Thomas's purple heart pin and Marcus's increasingly uncomfortable demeanor. A middle-aged businessman had stopped cutting his steak, his attention completely focused on the conversation at the hostess station. "The thing is," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet restaurant, "the food might be excellent, but the company leaves something to be desired." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the dining room. Jessica's face had gone pale, and Marcus looked as if he wanted to disappear into the polished marble floor. The casual brutality of their earlier dismissal had been turned back on them with surgical precision. Councilman Sterling, who had been absorbed in his phone, finally looked up at the commotion. His political instincts, honed by years of navigating public relations disasters, immediately assessed the situation. An elderly veteran being mistreated in a high-end restaurant? It was the kind of story that could dominate local news cycles and destroy careers.
"What seems to be the problem here?" Sterling asked, his voice carrying the practiced concern of a man who knew how to work a room. Marcus turned toward the councilman with obvious relief, seeing a potential ally in damage control. "Just a small misunderstanding, sir. We're working to resolve it." But Thomas was watching Sterling with the same careful attention he had given Marcus. He saw the political calculation, the way the man's eyes had immediately gone to the purple heart pin and assessed its public relations value. Everything about Sterling's suddenly helpful demeanor screamed opportunism. "I don't think we've been introduced," Sterling said, extending his hand toward Thomas with the kind of firm grip that photographers loved to capture. "Richard Sterling, Portland City Council." Thomas looked at the offered hand, but didn't take it. "Thomas Mitchell," he said simply. The non-handshake hung in the air awkwardly. Sterling's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with political determination. "Mr. Mitchell, I couldn't help but notice your purple heart. Thank you for your service." The phrase rolled off Sterling's tongue with practiced ease, the kind of automatic response that politicians deployed like verbal shields. But to Thomas, who had heard the same empty words countless times, it sounded hollow and rehearsed. "Which service would that be?" Thomas asked quietly. The question was unexpected, and Sterling blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry?" "You thanked me for my service," Thomas said, his pale blue eyes fixed on the councilman's face. "I'm curious which service you're referring to. The 3 tours in Vietnam? The 2 years training recruits at Fort Benning? The decade I spent with the VA helping other veterans navigate the system? Or maybe the 40 years I spent building schools and hospitals as a contractor?" Each item in the list was delivered with the same quiet precision, but their cumulative weight was devastating. Here was a man whose entire life had been dedicated to serving others, while the people around him had judged him solely on the basis of his clothing and appearance. Sterling's political composure cracked slightly. All of it, of course. Your entire service to the community." "Interesting, because 5 minutes ago, your friend here couldn't find me a table in a half-empty restaurant." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment.
Around the dining room, conversations had stopped entirely. The elderly woman in the Chanel suit was leaning forward, her attention completely captured by the unfolding drama. The businessman had pulled out his phone and was discreetly recording. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, each gaze carrying judgment and the potential for social media infamy. In an age where discrimination could go viral in minutes, he was acutely aware that his career hung in the balance. "There was a misunderstanding about our reservation system," Marcus said desperately. "We'd be honored to seat you immediately." Thomas shook his head slowly. "The only misunderstanding here is your assumption that you could judge a man's worth by his appearance." He turned to address the broader dining room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I came here today to have a quiet lunch and remember my wife. She passed 2 years ago, and this was part of our weekly tradition. She always said that how people treat you when they think you can't do anything for them tells you everything about their character." The personal revelation hit the room like a physical force. Suddenly, this wasn't just about discrimination. It was about a grieving widower being denied a simple dignity while trying to honor his wife's memory. The elderly woman in the Chanel suit pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Margaret always believed that everyone deserved to be treated with respect. Rich or poor, young or old, it didn't matter to her. She saw the person, not the packaging. He looked directly at Jessica, then at Marcus, his gaze carrying the weight of moral authority. She would have been ashamed of what happened here today. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen sound seemed muted, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Jessica's face was flushed with shame, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Marcus looked as if he wanted to crawl under the nearest table. But Thomas wasn't finished. He reached into his wallet, a worn leather billfold that had seen decades of use, and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a younger version of himself in dress uniform, standing beside a beautiful woman in a simple wedding dress. "This was taken the day I came home from my second tour," he said, his voice softening with memory. "Margaret waited 2 years for me, working double shifts at the hospital to save money for our wedding. She never complained, never asked for anything except that I come home safe. She worked as a nurse for 40 years, taking care of other people's children and grandparents. She never made much money, but she was richer in kindness than anyone in this room." The emotional weight of his words was palpable. Around the dining room, several people were openly wiping their eyes. The businessman with the phone had stopped recording, seemingly transfixed by the story unfolding before him. "Every Tuesday for 6 months, I've tried to come to a nice restaurant for lunch. It was her idea originally. She said we'd earned the right to treat ourselves well after all the years of sacrifice. After she died, it became my way of keeping her memory alive. Today was supposed to be special. It would have been our 52nd anniversary."
The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. The elderly woman in the Chanel suit let out a small gasp, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Even Councilman Sterling, with all his political armor, looked genuinely moved. Thomas looked around the dining room one final time, his gaze taking in the faces of people who had been content to ignore his mistreatment just minutes before. "Margaret always said that a person's true character comes out in how they treat those who can't fight back. She was right about that, just like she was right about most things." He turned toward the door, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. But as he moved to leave, something unexpected occurred. The elderly woman in the Chanel suit stood up from her table, her movement deliberate and commanding. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it?" Thomas paused, turning to face her with polite attention. She was perhaps 75, with silver hair perfectly styled and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her expensive clothing and jewelry marked her as someone of significant means,
but there was something in her bearing that suggested substance beyond mere wealth. "My name is Eleanor Whitman," she said, walking toward him with measured steps. "I couldn't help but overhear, and I want you to know that not everyone here shares the management's appalling lack of judgment." The name meant nothing to Thomas, but he could see recognition flickering across Marcus's face. Eleanor Whitman was old Portland royalty. Her family's foundation had funded half the cultural institutions in the city, and her opinion carried weight in social circles that could make or break establishments like Mitchell's Steakhouse. "Ma'am," Thomas said, with a respectful nod. Eleanor's eyes went to the Purple Heart pin, and when she looked back at his face, there was recognition there, not of him personally, but of what he represented. "My late husband served in Korea," she said simply. "I know something about the cost of service." The simple statement carried more genuine respect than all of Sterling's political platitudes combined. Thomas felt something ease in his chest, a small acknowledgement that not everyone in this room had failed the test of basic human decency. Eleanor Whitman's intervention had shifted something fundamental in the restaurant's atmosphere. The weight of her social standing, combined with Thomas's quiet dignity, created a tension that no one seemed quite sure how to navigate. Marcus Webb found himself caught between his ingrained prejudices and the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from generations of civic leadership, "I wonder if you might join me at my table. I was dining alone, and I would consider it an honor to share a meal with a fellow veteran's family member." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Thomas studied her face, seeing genuine warmth beneath the patrician composure. This wasn't the calculated gesture of a politician or the desperate damage control of a businessman. It was a simple act of human decency from someone who understood the true meaning of service. "That's very kind of you, ma'am," Thomas said, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your lunch." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied with a slight smile. "My husband always said that the best conversations happened over shared meals. Besides, I have some stories about Korea that might interest you, assuming you don't mind listening to an old woman's memories." Before Thomas could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his desperation now openly visible. "Mrs. Whitman, please allow me to move you both to our finest table, the corner booth with the view. It's usually reserved for special occasions." Eleanor's expression turned glacial. "Mr. Webb, I believe we've already established your establishment's definition of special occasions and who qualifies for them." The rebuke was delivered with the kind of polite venom that only true aristocracy could master. Marcus actually took a step backward, the color draining from his face as he realized that Eleanor Whitman, whose family's charitable foundation was a major supporter of Portland's cultural scene, was now firmly aligned against him. "Please, Mrs. Whitman," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "There was a misunderstanding earlier. We would be honored to host you both in our VIP section." Thomas watched this display with a mixture of disgust and fascination. The same man who had been ready to throw him out 5 minutes ago was now practically begging for forgiveness, not because he had recognized the error of his ways, but because he had been caught discriminating in front of someone whose opinion mattered. "The misunderstanding," Thomas said quietly, "was your assumption that a man's worth is measured by his wallet rather than his character." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. Mr. Webb, your establishment's behavior today has been nothing short of shameful. I'll be discussing this incident with the Portland Business Ethics Committee, of which I happen to be the chairwoman." The threat landed like a physical blow. Marcus knew that the Ethics Committee had the power to influence everything from city contracts to charitable donations. A negative review from Eleanor Whitman could effectively blacklist Mitchell's Steakhouse from the kind of high society events that made up the bulk of their profit margin. Please, Mrs. Whitman, Marcus said, his professional composure finally cracking completely. Mr. Mitchell, your meal today will be complimentary, of course. And Mrs. Whitman, perhaps we could discuss this privately. Thomas felt a surge of anger at the transparent attempt at bribery. Keep your free meal, he said, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made several nearby diners look up from their plates. The fact that you're offering charity now just proves you still don't understand what you did wrong. The moral clarity of the statement cut through the restaurant's atmosphere like a blade. Thomas wasn't interested in compensation or special treatment. He wanted the basic respect that should have been afforded to him from the beginning. The purity of that demand made Marcus's scrambling attempts at damage control look even more pathetic. Eleanor moved closer to Thomas, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor. Mr. Mitchell, I meant what I said about joining me, not as an act of charity, but because I genuinely believe we might have something to learn from each other. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't encountered since walking into the restaurant: honest respect. Eleanor Whitman wasn't trying to use him to make a point or advance an agenda. She was simply treating him like a human being worthy of consideration. In that case, Thomas said, I'd be honored to accept your invitation. The simple acceptance seemed to deflate Marcus's remaining hopes for damage control. He watched helplessly as Portland's most influential socialite linked arms with the man he had tried to reject, walking together toward her table like old friends. Behind them, Councilman Sterling was frantically typing on his phone, no doubt calculating the political implications of being present during a discrimination incident involving a veteran. Jessica remained frozen at the hostess station, her face a mask of mortification, as she realized that her casual cruelty had just cost the restaurant its most important patron. Eleanor's table was positioned near one of the large windows, offering a clear view of the memorial park across the street. She had chosen the spot deliberately. It allowed her to watch the bronze soldier statue that stood guard over the small garden where local veterans gathered each Veterans Day. I noticed you looking at the memorial earlier, she said as they settled into their chairs. Do you visit often? Thomas followed her gaze to the statue, his expression softening. Every Tuesday for the past 6 months, I sit on the bench there after lunch and think about the men who didn't make it home. It helps keep their memory alive. Eleanor nodded with understanding. My husband used to do something similar. He'd visit the Korean War Memorial in Washington every year on the anniversary of his discharge. He said it wasn't about dwelling on the past, it was about honoring the sacrifice. Your husband sounds like a good man, Thomas said. He was, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the weight of decades of shared memories. Charles spent 30 years in Korea, fighting in conditions that would have broken lesser men. He came home with frostbite scars and nightmares, but also with an unshakable sense of duty to his fellow veterans. She paused to sip her water, her eyes distant with memory. He spent 30 years running a non-profit that helped veterans transition back to civilian life. Free job training, counseling, housing assistance, whatever they needed. He used to say that a country that sends its young people to war has an obligation to take care of them when they come home. Thomas felt a familiar pang of recognition. How many times had he heard similar sentiments from fellow veterans? How many men and women had he met over the years who carried the same quiet dedication to serving others long after their official service had ended? What branch? Thomas asked. Army Corps of Engineers, Eleanor replied. He spent most of his time building bridges and airstrips under enemy fire. Not exactly glamorous work, but it kept a lot of people alive. Thomas smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he had shown since entering the restaurant. Engineers don't get enough credit. In Vietnam, we used to joke that the infantry got the headlines, but the engineers got us home. Eleanor's eyes brightened with interest. You served in Vietnam? Thomas confirmed. 3 tours. First as a combat engineer, then as a squad leader, finally as a training instructor. I was supposed to be done after the first tour, but—" He shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes of duty and sacrifice that couldn't be captured in words. "But you kept going back," Eleanor finished, understanding perfectly. "Someone had to, and I was good at keeping people alive." The understatement was so profound that Eleanor actually paused her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She was looking at a man who had voluntarily returned to one of the most dangerous conflicts in American history, not once, but twice, because he felt responsible for the safety of other soldiers. "Is that how you earned the Purple Heart?" she asked gently. Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to the pin on his collar, a gesture Eleanor recognized as both protective and painful. "One of them," he said quietly. "One of them?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. Thomas looked out the window at the memorial statue, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The first one was for shrapnel wounds from a mortar attack during my second tour. The second—" He paused, his jaw tightening, almost imperceptibly. "The second was for what happened at Firebase Charlie." Eleanor didn't recognize the name, but she could see from Thomas's expression that it carried significant weight. She waited patiently, understanding that some stories couldn't be rushed. "We were a small engineering unit," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone recounting facts rather than reliving trauma. 23 men responsible for maintaining a remote firebase near the Cambodian border. Intelligence said the area was secure, but intelligence was about a lot of things in those days. He turned his coffee cup in small circles on the table, a nervous habit that Eleanor suspected he wasn't even aware of. "The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday. Funny how I still remember it was a Tuesday. 3 companies of NVA regulars, well-armed and well-coordinated. They hit us with everything they had. Mortars, rockets, small arms fire." Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the quiet intensity of his recollection. "Our radio operator was killed in the first 5 minutes, Thomas said. The commanding officer was wounded and unconscious. Suddenly, I was the senior man left standing, responsible for keeping 22 soldiers alive until help arrived." He looked directly at Eleanor, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized from her husband's face during his darkest moments. The weight of command, the burden of decisions that meant life or death for other human beings. The fire base was positioned on high ground, but that worked against us. We were exposed, with limited cover and no way to retreat. The enemy had us surrounded and outnumbered 3 to 1. Standard military doctrine would have been to radio for evacuation and try to hold out until extraction. "But you couldn't radio for help," Eleanor said, beginning to understand. "No radio, no backup, no cavalry coming over the hill," Thomas confirmed. "Just 23 scared young men with limited ammunition and an enemy that seemed determined to overrun our position before nightfall." The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade away as Eleanor found herself completely absorbed in Thomas's story. Around them, other diners continued their conversations about business deals and social events, completely unaware of the extraordinary narrative unfolding at the window table. "So what did you do?" Eleanor asked softly. Thomas smiled grimly. "I remembered something my grandfather taught me about chess. He used to say that when you're losing badly, sometimes the only way to save the game is to sacrifice your most valuable pieces to buy time for the others." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, sensing where the story was heading. "I took 4 volunteers, the best shots we had, and we staged a diversionary attack on the enemy's left flank. The idea was to draw their attention away from the main firebase long enough for the rest of the unit to establish better defensive positions." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "It worked better than we planned. The enemy committed almost their entire force to pursuing us, leaving the firebase lightly defended. My men were able to hold out until reinforcements arrived 6 hours later." Eleanor waited for him to continue, but Thomas seemed lost in memory. Finally, she asked the question she was dreading to hear answered. "The diversionary team?" "2 of us made it back, Jimmy Rodriguez and myself. The other 3, Peterson, Williams, and Davis, they bought us the time we needed, with their lives." The weight of survivor's guilt was audible in his voice, even after all these years. Eleanor understood now why Thomas carried himself with such quiet dignity, why he had faced the restaurant's discrimination with such unshakable composure. This was a man who had made life and death decisions under the worst possible circumstances, who had sacrificed everything to save others. The medal was for the diversionary action, for conspicuous gallantry and risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in action against the enemy. That's what the citation says anyway. Eleanor stared at him with growing amazement. "Thomas, that's not just a Purple Heart. That's the Congressional Medal of Honor." Thomas nodded slowly, his hand moving again to touch the small pins on his collar. Eleanor realized with shock that what she had taken for a simple Purple Heart was actually accompanied by a much smaller pin, the distinctive star-shaped medal that represented the highest military honor the United States could bestow. The revelation of Thomas's Medal of Honor hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Eleanor Whitman stared at the unassuming man across from her, trying to reconcile the quiet dignity she had witnessed with the extraordinary heroism he had just described. In her 75 years of life, during which she had met presidents, celebrities, and titans of industry, she had never sat across from someone who wore America's highest military decoration. "My God, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. "Do you realize what this means? You're not just a veteran, you're a living piece of American history." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unused to such attention. "I'm just a man who did what needed to be done," he said quietly. "The real heroes are buried in Arlington." But Eleanor was already thinking beyond the immediate moment, her mind working with the strategic precision that had made her one of Portland's most effective philanthropists. She understood the power of narrative, the way a single story could change hearts and minds, and she had just been handed the most powerful story she had encountered in decades. Across the dining room, Marcus Webb was watching their conversation with growing anxiety. He couldn't hear what they were discussing, but he could see the intensity in Eleanor's expression, the way she leaned forward with obvious fascination. Whatever Thomas Mitchell was telling her, it was clearly having a profound impact. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant manager. 3 customers have already left negative reviews online about the incident. Social media is starting to pick it up. The message sent a chill down Marcus's spine. In the age of viral content, a discrimination story involving a veteran could destroy a restaurant's reputation overnight. He watched helplessly as other diners continued to steal glances at Thomas and Eleanor, some of them clearly recording video with their phones. At the hostess station, Jessica Morrison was experiencing her own crisis of conscience. She had grown up in a military family. Her father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and the sight of Thomas's service pins had triggered memories of her childhood. She remembered the pride in her father's voice when he talked about the Medal of Honor recipients he had met, the reverence with which he spoke of their sacrifices.
The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. She had dismissed and insulted a Medal of Honor recipient based solely on his appearance, treating him with less respect than she would show to a celebrity's personal assistant. The shame was a physical weight in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Meanwhile, at Eleanor's table, the conversation had shifted to Thomas's post-military life. Eleanor was discovering that his service to others hadn't ended when he hung up his uniform. After I was discharged, Thomas was saying, I used my GI Bill benefits to study construction management. The idea was to build something instead of destroying things for once. Eleanor nodded, understanding the psychological need for such a transition. And that led to the contracting business you mentioned? Mitchell Construction. We specialized in public works projects, schools, hospitals, community centers, places that would serve people for generations. He paused to take a sip of his coffee, which had grown cold during their conversation. Margaret always said that every school we built was a victory against ignorance. Every hospital was a victory against suffering. She had a way of making even the most mundane projects feel important. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. She was seeing a pattern in Thomas's life, a consistent dedication to serving others, whether in combat or in civilian life. This wasn't just a war hero. This was a man who had spent his entire existence making the world a better place. How many projects did you complete over the years? She asked. Thomas considered the question, his eyes distant with memory. 43 schools, 16 hospitals, 7 community centers, and more municipal buildings than I can count. We employed over 200 people at our peak, most of them veterans who needed a second chance. Eleanor's breath caught. You were hiring veterans long before it became fashionable? It wasn't about fashion. These men and women had served their country with honor. They deserved an opportunity to rebuild their lives with dignity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their server, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had been working at Mitchell Steakhouse for 3 years. Unlike Jessica at the hostess station, Sarah had been watching the drama unfold with growing admiration for Thomas's composure under pressure. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sarah said, her voice respectful but excited, but I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too, with the 1st Infantry Division. He always talked about the engineers who kept them supplied and got them out of impossible situations. Thomas looked up at her with genuine interest. What was his name? Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, Sarah replied. He passed away 5 years ago, but he never forgot the men who risked their lives to build landing zones under fire. Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. Bobby Chen? Tall guy? Great sense of humor? Called everyone brother? Sarah's eyes widened in shock. You knew him? We worked together during my 2nd tour, Thomas said, his face breaking into the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him. Bobby saved my life during a supply run near Da Nang, dragged me out of a burning jeep after we hit a mine. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. He never told us details about his service, just said he did what he had to do. He was one of the good ones, Thomas said gently. Brave, loyal, always looking out for his brothers. You should be proud to carry his name. The unexpected connection seemed to electrify the air around their table. Eleanor watched in fascination as Sarah's professional composure cracked, revealing the deep emotion beneath. He would have been so honored to know you remembered him, Sarah said, wiping away tears. He always said that the bonds formed in combat never break, even after death. Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out a different photograph. This one showing a group of young soldiers in jungle fatigues, their arms around each other's shoulders. He pointed to a figure in the center, a young Asian American soldier with a wide grin. This was taken 3 days before the supply run I mentioned. Bobby is right there in the middle, keeping everyone's spirits up as usual. Sarah stared at the photograph, seeing her grandfather as a young man for the first time in decades. The image captured something that family photos never could, the camaraderie and brotherhood that had sustained these men through the worst experiences of their lives. Could you possibly get a copy of this? Sarah asked hesitantly. Keep it, Thomas said, handing her the photograph. I have others, and I think Bobby would want his granddaughter to have this one. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous that Sarah actually gasped. Here was a man who had been insulted and humiliated by her colleagues, yet he was showing kindness to her because of a connection to her grandfather. Eleanor watched this exchange with growing amazement. Every revelation about Thomas seemed to add another layer to his character. He wasn't just a war hero or a successful businessman. He was a man who carried the memory of every person who had touched his life, who honored the fallen by remembering their humanity. The interaction with Sarah had attracted the attention of other staff members, who were now watching their table with obvious curiosity. Word was spreading through the restaurant that the man Marcus had tried to reject was someone far more significant than anyone had realized. At the bar, the bartender, a former Marine named Derek Washington, was straining to overhear the conversation. He had noticed Thomas's military bearing from the moment he walked in, recognizing something in the older man's posture that spoke of service and sacrifice. When he caught a fragment of the conversation about Vietnam, his interest was piqued even further.
Derek had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood the unique bond that connected veterans across generations and conflicts. He also understood the particular reverence reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. They were living legends, men whose actions had transcended normal heroism to become part of military folklore. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Derek approached Eleanor's table during a lull in the conversation. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Thomas, his bearing unconsciously shifting to a more military posture. "I'm Derek Washington, former Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. I couldn't help but notice your decorations, and I wanted to say it's an honor to serve you today." Thomas looked up at the young veteran, seeing the pride and respect in his eyes. "Thank you, Derek. What years were you in Iraq?" 2005 to 2009, sir. Fallujah and Ramadi." Thomas nodded gravely. "Hard fighting. I'm glad you made it home." "Yes, sir. Thanks to Marines like my grandfather, who served in Vietnam and taught me that coming home was just the first part of the job. The second part was living in a way that honored the sacrifice of those who didn't make it back." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine at the young Marine's words. She was witnessing something rare and beautiful, the passing of wisdom and honor from one generation of warriors to the next. These men were connected by something deeper than shared experience. They were bound by a commitment to ideals that transcended their individual lives. But as this powerful moment unfolded, Eleanor became aware of another dynamic playing out across the restaurant. The other patrons, Portland's social and business elite, were watching these interactions with growing fascination. She could see the wheels turning in their minds as they began to understand exactly who Thomas Mitchell was. Councilman Sterling had put away his phone and was listening intently to the conversations around Eleanor's table. His political instincts were screaming at him that he was witnessing something that could either make or destroy his career, depending on how he handled it. The businessman who had been recording earlier was now openly filming, his phone capturing the extraordinary scene of a Medal of Honor recipient being treated with the respect he should have received from the beginning. Eleanor realized that they were at a tipping point. The story of Thomas's mistreatment was about to explode beyond the confines of the restaurant, and when it did, the consequences would be far-reaching. Eleanor Whitman had spent her entire adult life fighting for causes she believed in. She had used her wealth and influence to support civil rights, veterans' affairs, and social justice initiatives. But she had never encountered a situation that combined all of her passions so perfectly. Looking at Thomas Mitchell, war hero, successful businessman, devoted husband, and champion of veterans' rights, she saw an opportunity to strike a blow for human dignity that would resonate far beyond the walls of one Portland restaurant. The question was, whether Thomas would be willing to let her turn his private pain into a public crusade for change. The atmosphere inside Mitchell's Steakhouse had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as an isolated incident of discrimination had evolved into something far more complex and potentially explosive. Thomas Mitchell, the quiet man in the worn flannel shirt, had become the center of a growing storm that threatened to engulf everyone in its path. Eleanor Whitman excused herself from the table, ostensibly to make a phone call, but Thomas could see the strategic calculation in her eyes. She was a woman who understood how to leverage influence, and she had just discovered the most powerful ammunition she had ever possessed. As she walked toward the restaurant's entrance, her phone already pressed to her ear, Thomas felt a familiar unease settling in his chest. He had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid the spotlight, preferring to serve quietly and let his actions speak for themselves. The idea of becoming a public symbol, even for a worthy cause, made him profoundly uncomfortable. But he was beginning to realize that the choice might no longer be his to make. Derek Washington, the Marine veteran bartender, had returned to his station, but was clearly struggling to focus on his work. He kept glancing toward Thomas's table, his expression a mixture of awe and anger. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, he approached Marcus Webb, who was hovering near the kitchen doors like a man awaiting execution. "Boss," Derek said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus looked up at his employee with haunted eyes. "Derek, I know this looks bad, but—" "Bad?" Derek's voice rose slightly, causing several nearby diners to look in their direction. "Marcus, that man is a Medal of Honor recipient. Do you understand what that means?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had suspected that Thomas was more than an ordinary veteran, but the full magnitude of his error was only now becoming clear. The Medal of Honor wasn't just another military decoration, it was the pinnacle of American heroism, reserved for actions that went beyond courage into the realm of the extraordinary. "How do you know?" Marcus whispered, but part of him already knew the answer. "Because I've studied every Medal of Honor citation from Vietnam. I know the names, the stories, the battles. Thomas Mitchell, Firebase Charlie, 1971. He saved 22 men by leading a suicidal diversionary attack against overwhelming odds. 3 of his team died so that the others could live." Marcus felt his knees go weak. He groped for a nearby chair, his mind reeling with the implications of what Derek was telling him. He hadn't just discriminated against a veteran, he had insulted and humiliated one of America's greatest living heroes. "There's more," Derek continued relentlessly. "After the war, he built half the public infrastructure in this state. Schools, hospitals, community centers, all projects that employed hundreds of veterans who couldn't find work anywhere else. The man you tried to throw out has probably done more for Oregon than every politician in Salem combined." The indictment was delivered with surgical precision. Each fact another nail in the coffin of Marcus's career. He could see his future unraveling in real time. The news stories, the social media outrage, the boycotts that would inevitably follow. Mitchell's Steakhouse would become synonymous with discrimination and disrespect for veterans. Meanwhile, across the dining room, Councilman Sterling was engaged in his own crisis management. His political instincts had kicked into overdrive, and he was frantically calculating how to position himself as a champion of veterans' rights rather than a bystander to their mistreatment. Sterling approached Thomas's table with the calculated confidence of a man who had spent years navigating political minefields. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a campaign speech, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I believe there's an opportunity here for the city to honor your service properly." Thomas looked up at the politician with the same steady gaze that had unnerved Marcus earlier. "What kind of opportunity, Councilman?" "Well," Sterling said, settling into Eleanor's vacant chair without invitation, "Portland has been discussing the creation of a new Veterans Memorial. Your story, your sacrifice, could be the centerpiece of that project. Imagine the inspiration it would provide to future generations." Thomas listened politely, but Sterling could see skepticism in the older man's eyes. The councilman was clearly more interested in political capital than genuine tribute, and Thomas had developed a finely tuned ability to detect insincerity. "That's a generous offer," Thomas said carefully, "but I'm not interested in being anyone's poster child. The men who died at Firebase Charlie deserve to be remembered, but not as props for political theater." The smile faltered slightly. He wasn't used to having his grand gestures rejected, especially from people who should have been grateful for his attention. "I understand your reluctance, but think of the good we could do. Veterans' issues need visibility, advocacy. Veterans need jobs, healthcare, and respect, not photo opportunities." The rebuke was delivered so mildly that it took Sterling a moment to realize he had been dismissed. He looked around the dining room, suddenly aware that their conversation was being observed by dozens of potential voters. His political instincts screamed at him to find a graceful way to retreat, but his ego demanded that he salvage something from the encounter. "Of course," Sterling said, forcing his smile back into place. "But surely you understand that sometimes visibility is necessary to achieve those practical goals. The public needs to see veterans like yourself, to understand what service really means." Thomas studied the politician's face, seeing the calculation behind the earnest expression. "Councilman, in my experience, the people who most need to understand service are the ones who talk about it the most and practice it the least." The observation hit Sterling like a slap. He had built his entire career on talking about supporting veterans while doing as little as possible to actually help them. His voting record was littered with half measures and symbolic gestures that generated good publicity without requiring significant resources or political risk. Before Sterling could formulate a response, Eleanor returned from her phone call, her expression grim with purpose. She took in the scene at the table, the flustered politician, Thomas's obvious discomfort, and immediately understood what had transpired. "Councilman Sterling, I believe your lunch guests are waiting for you." It was a polite but unmistakable dismissal. Sterling looked between Eleanor and Thomas, recognizing that he had been outmaneuvered by forces beyond his control. He stood slowly, his political composure still intact but clearly strained. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "please know that the city of Portland stands ready to honor your service in whatever way you deem appropriate." Thomas nodded politely, but said nothing. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken judgment, and Sterling finally retreated to his table, his face flushed with embarrassment. Eleanor settled back into her chair, her eyes bright with the energy of someone who had just set powerful forces in motion. "That was the Portland Veterans Coalition," she said without preamble. "I've called an emergency meeting for this evening. They need to know what happened here today." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to become a cause celeb. I just wanted to have lunch and remember my wife." "I understand," Eleanor gently said, "but sometimes we don't get to choose when history calls our name. What happened here today wasn't just about you. It was about how this city treats all veterans. You have a platform now, whether you wanted it or not." The weight of her words settled over Thomas like a familiar burden. He had never sought recognition for his military service or his post-war accomplishments. Recognition brought attention, and attention brought complications that could overshadow the work itself. But as he looked around the restaurant, he saw something that gave him pause. Derek Washington was watching their table with obvious admiration, clearly drawing inspiration from Thomas's dignity under pressure.
Sarah Chin was showing Bobby's photograph to other staff members, telling them about her grandfather's service with obvious pride. Even some of the customers seemed to be engaging with the veterans among them with newfound respect.
Perhaps Eleanor was right. Perhaps visibility wasn't always about ego or politics. Perhaps sometimes it was about reminding people of values they had forgotten, about honoring sacrifices they had taken for granted. Thomas's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. An elderly man in a crisp navy blazer approached their table, his bearing unmistakably military despite his advanced age. He moved slowly, but with purpose, aided by a walking stick that bore the emblem of the United States Navy. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of command even in its obvious frailty, "but I believe I know you, son." Thomas looked up, studying the stranger's face. There was something familiar about the set of his jaw, the directness of his gaze, but the memory remained elusive. "Admiral Joseph Hartwell, retired," the man continued, extending his hand. "I had the honor of presenting you with your Medal of Honor at the White House ceremony in 1972. The revelation hit Thomas like an electric shock. He rose from his chair with automatic military courtesy, his body remembering the protocol, even as his mind reeled with recognition. Admiral Hartwell had been the chief of naval operations, one of the most senior military officers in the country at the time. "Admiral," Thomas said, his voice tight with emotion, "I'm honored you remember." "Remember?" Hartwell chuckled, though his eyes were serious. "Son, I presented 43 Medals of Honor during my career. I remember every single recipient, every story, every sacrifice. But yours," he paused, his voice growing thick, "yours was special. The youngest man ever to receive the medal for actions in Vietnam, and one of the few who seemed more concerned about his fallen comrades than his own recognition." Eleanor watched this exchange with fascination, realizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The highest levels of military leadership, past and present, recognizing Thomas not just as a hero, but as a symbol of something greater. "What brings you to Portland, Admiral?" Thomas asked, still processing the unexpected encounter. Hartwell's expression grew grave. "I was visiting my grandson at Reed College when I heard what happened here today. Word travels fast in the veterans community, especially when it involves one of our Medal of Honor recipients being mistreated." Thomas felt his heart sink. The story was already spreading beyond the restaurant's walls, taking on a life of its own that he would be powerless to control. "I came to see for myself and to offer you whatever support you might need. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it cannot be allowed to stand without consequences." Eleanor leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "Admiral, what kind of consequences did you have in mind?" Hartwell's smile was grim but determined. "Mrs. Whitman, I may be 87 years old, but I still have friends in very high places. When a Medal of Honor recipient is disrespected, it's not just an insult to one man, it's an insult to every person who has ever worn the uniform. That kind of insult demands a response." Thomas looked between Eleanor and the Admiral, realizing that the quiet storm he had sensed earlier was about to become a hurricane. The simple act of trying to honor his wife's memory had set in motion forces that would soon be beyond anyone's ability to control. The question was whether those forces would ultimately serve justice or simply create more pain for everyone involved. 3 months had passed since that pivotal Tuesday at Mitchell's Steakhouse, and the reverberations were still being felt throughout Portland and beyond. The story had become a catalyst for conversations about dignity, service, and the way society treats its heroes when they're no longer wearing uniforms. Thomas Mitchell stood in the lobby of the newly renovated Portland Veterans Center, watching as the final preparations were made for the evening's dedication ceremony.
The building had been transformed from a cramped, underfunded facility into a state-of-the-art resource center for veterans and their families. The renovation had been funded entirely through private donations that poured in after Thomas's story went national. But Thomas wasn't focused on the gleaming new facilities or the impressive technology that would help veterans access services. His attention was drawn to a simple memorial wall near the entrance where photographs of fallen service members were displayed alongside their stories of sacrifice. At the center of the display was a picture of the 5 men from Firebase Charlie: Peterson, Williams, Davis, Rodriguez, and Chen, the brothers who had made the ultimate sacrifice. "They would have loved this," said a familiar voice behind him. Thomas turned to find Eleanor Whitman approaching, elegant as always in a navy blue dress that complemented the formal nature of the evening ceremony. In the month since their first meeting, she had become not just an ally but a genuine friend, someone who understood the weight of responsibility that came with unexpected prominence. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked gently. Thomas considered the question, his eyes moving across the bustling lobby where veterans of all ages were gathering for the ceremony. He saw Derek Washington, who had left his bartending job to become the center's full-time veterans advocate. Sarah Chen was there with her family, including her young son, who wore a miniature military uniform in honor of his great-grandfather. Dozens of other faces filled the space, veterans who had found new purpose, families who had received much-needed support, community members who had been inspired to get involved. "About speaking up, no," Thomas said finally. "About the way it all spiraled beyond my control, sometimes. But Margaret used to say that you can't control the storms, only how you navigate through them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Hartwell, who moved slowly but determinedly through the crowd. At 87, he remained a commanding presence, his dress uniform bearing the insignia of a lifetime of distinguished service. Behind him walked a younger man in civilian clothes, his grandson, Michael, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for veterans' rights on the Reed College campus. "Thomas," the Admiral said, his voice carrying despite its frailty, "are you ready for this evening's festivities?" Thomas smiled ruefully. "As ready as I'll ever be for a room full of people wanting to shake my hand and thank me for my service." "You know it's about more than that," Michael Hartwell interjected, his youthful enthusiasm evident. "This center is going to help thousands of veterans over the next decade. The education programs, the job placement services, the mental health resources. None of it would have existed without what happened at that restaurant." It was true, Thomas knew. The public outrage over his mistreatment had generated not just sympathy, but action. Corporate donors had stepped forward with unprecedented generosity. Politicians who had given lip service to veterans' issues suddenly found the political will to support meaningful legislation. Most importantly, ordinary citizens had been inspired to volunteer their time and resources to help those who had served. But the personal cost had been significant. Thomas's quiet retirement had been replaced by a schedule of speaking engagements, interviews, and ceremonial appearances. His small apartment had been besieged by reporters and well-wishers. The simple anonymity he had cherished was gone forever, replaced by a recognition that felt both honorable and burdensome. Across the lobby, Marcus Webb stood near the registration table, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. The former general manager of Mitchell's Steakhouse had requested permission to attend the ceremony, and Thomas had agreed despite Eleanor's objections. It was important, Thomas felt, to allow people the opportunity for genuine redemption. The restaurant had closed permanently 6 weeks after the incident, unable to survive the sustained boycotts and negative publicity. Marcus had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his comfortable lifestyle. But in the months that followed, he had undertaken a journey of self-reflection that had fundamentally changed him. He had volunteered hundreds of hours at local veterans organizations, not for publicity,
but because he genuinely wanted to make amends for his behavior. He had enrolled in sensitivity training and cultural competency courses. Most significantly, he had used his savings to establish a small scholarship fund for children of veterans, naming it after Margaret Mitchell in honor of Thomas's late wife. Thomas excused himself from Eleanor and the Admiral and walked over to where Marcus stood uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said simply. Marcus looked up, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and lingering shame. "I wasn't sure I should. I know some people think I don't belong here. Everyone belongs here if they're here for the right reasons. The question is, are you?" Marcus met Thomas's eyes directly for the first time since that awful day at the restaurant. "I'm here because I learned something about myself that I didn't like, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be better. Not for redemption or forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." Thomas studied the young man's face, seeing sincerity where once there was calculating ambition. "That's a start," he said. "Margaret always believed that people could change if they truly wanted to. I'm inclined to give them the chance to prove her right." The brief conversation was observed by several other attendees, including a reporter from the Portland Tribune who had been covering the story since its beginning. The reporter, Janet Morrison, had initially been drawn to the story by its dramatic elements, the discrimination, the hidden hero, the public outrage. But as she had followed the story's evolution, she had become fascinated by its deeper implications. Her articles had explored not just the incident, but the broader questions it raised about how society recognizes and values service. She had interviewed dozens of veterans, uncovering stories of quiet heroism and post-service contributions that had gone unrecognized for decades. The series had won her a Pulitzer Prize nomination and, more importantly, had sparked a national conversation about honoring veterans not just on holidays, but in daily interactions. As the formal ceremony began, Thomas found himself seated on the stage next to Senator Patricia Hayes, who had flown in from Washington specifically for the event. Senator Hayes had been instrumental in securing federal funding for veteran support programs across the Pacific Northwest, legislation that had been directly inspired by Thomas's story. "Mr. Litchell," she said as they waited for their turn to speak, "I want you to know that your courage in speaking out has changed lives across this country. We've passed more meaningful veterans legislation in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years." Thomas nodded politely, but his attention was focused on the audience. He saw faces young and old, military and civilian, all gathered around a shared commitment to supporting those who had served. It was Margaret's vision made manifest, a community united by common values rather than divided by superficial differences. When his turn came to speak, Thomas approached the podium with the same quiet dignity he had shown that day at the restaurant. The applause was thunderous and sustained, but he waited patiently for silence before beginning. "3 months ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I walked into a restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet lunch and a few minutes to remember my wife. I had no intention of becoming a symbol or starting a movement. I just wanted to be treated with basic human dignity." He paused, his eyes finding familiar faces in the crowd. What happened that day was wrong, but it wasn't unusual. Veterans across this country face discrimination and disrespect every day, usually without cameras recording or newspapers writing stories. The only difference in my case was that the right people were watching at the right time. The room was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. But the real heroes of this story aren't the ones who spoke up that day. They're the ones who've been working quietly for decades to support veterans and their families. People like Derek Washington, who left a secure job to advocate for his brothers and sisters in arms. People like Sarah Chen, who honors her grandfather's memory by volunteering at the VA hospital every weekend. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he continued.
They're also the people who made mistakes and chose to learn from them, like Marcus Webb, who's here tonight, not because he has to be, but because he wants to be part of the solution. He looked directly at Marcus, who was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. The lesson of this story isn't that one incident can change the world. It's that ordinary people, making the choice to treat each other with dignity and respect, can create extraordinary change when they work together. Thomas paused, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the purple heart pin on his lapel, a gesture that had become familiar to everyone who knew his story. My grandfather used to tell me that a man's true character is revealed not in moments of triumphs, but in moments of trial. How we treat each other when times are difficult, when it would be easier to look away or stay silent, that's when we show who we really are. He looked out at the audience, seeing tears in many eyes, including Eleanor's. 3 men died at Firebase Charlie's so that 22 others could live. They didn't make that sacrifice so I could be honored or celebrated. They did it because they believed in something bigger than themselves, the idea that every life has value, that every person deserves dignity, that service to others is the highest calling.
Thomas's voice grew quiet, but remained strong. Margaret believed the same thing. She spent her life caring for others, often for people who couldn't repay her kindness. She taught me that true service isn't about recognition or reward. It's about making the world a little better than you found it. He gestured toward the memorial wall where the photographs of the fallen were displayed. This center exists not because of what happened to me, but because of what they gave up. Every veteran who finds help here, every family that receives support, every young person who learns about service and sacrifice, that's their legacy. Thomas stepped back from the podium, and the applause that followed was different from what had come before. It wasn't just appreciation for his words, but recognition of a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of his story. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Thomas found himself standing once again before the memorial wall. The photographs of his fallen comrades seemed to watch over the bustling activity of the new center, their sacrifice given new meaning by the lives that would be changed within these walls. Eleanor approached and stood beside him in comfortable silence. After a few moments, she spoke. Margaret would have been proud. Thomas nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to trust his voice. After a long moment, he managed to speak. She always said that the best way to honor the past is to serve the future. I think she would have liked what we've built here. What you've built, Eleanor corrected gently. None of this would have happened without your courage to stand up when it mattered. Thomas shook his head. It happened because a lot of people chose to do the right thing when they had the chance. I was just the spark. They were the kindling. As they prepared to leave, Thomas took one last look around the center. Tomorrow, it would be full of veterans seeking help, volunteers offering service, and staff members dedicated to making a difference. The simple dignity he had sought in a restaurant had grown into something far greater, a community of people committed to honoring service through service. The memorial wall caught his eye one final time, and Thomas Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient, successful businessman, devoted husband, and reluctant hero, whispered a quiet promise to his friends who would never grow old. I kept faith with you, brothers. I kept faith. Outside, the Portland night was clear and cool, and Thomas walked slowly toward his car, finally at peace with the role that fate had thrust upon him. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with character. Sometimes the greatest service isn't performed in uniform,
but in the simple act of treating every person with the dignity they deserve. The quiet veteran had found his voice, and in doing so had reminded an entire community of what it truly means to serve with honor.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.